I'm very, very happy to be here with you in Ronda Festival. I'm very excited to be speaking with two poets from different backgrounds. And Ana Luisa Amaral is a poet who has celebrated her 30 years of career last year. She started in 1990 with the book Minha Senhora de Quê, Our Lady of What? And she has published widely since. She's an academic. She has taught in the University of Oporto. She's now retired, but she's still a researcher, and she's a pioneer in Portugal of gender studies and queer studies, and she has a research line in intersexualities. She has been widely translated as well in her poetry to German, French, English, Dutch, so on and so forth. She has published so much that we cannot tell all the titles here. I would underline The Art of Being a Tiger, Art de Ser Tigre. Nevertheless, What's in a Name? Her most recent one is Agora. And Will Harris has published his debut book of poetry last year. He nevertheless has published before. I have been doing some research. So there was a pamphlet in 2017. All this is implied. And a book, a non-fiction book, Mixed Race Superman, Kino, Obama, and Multiracial Experience, which is an essay about Barack Obama, Kino Reeves, race, silence, masculinity. And his debut book is called Rendang. We'll talk about that title in a while. It has been published by Granta, and it has been awarded the Poetry Book Society Choice Prize, and he was shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize, and Luisa Amaral, of course, has also won several awards throughout her career. And curiously, this is an interesting mix because these poets who are wide apart, they do have many things in common. And it was a joy for me when I was preparing this talk to discover that. So without further ado, I'm going to start with the first question, and that comes from the title of Ana Luisa Amaral's first book, the latest one that has been translated into English, What's in a Name, which is also a title of a Portuguese book, though the English version published by New Directions in the US has more poems. And What's in a Name, as we know, comes from Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, the soliloquy, where Juliet asks, would a rose have a different name in another place? It's not like that. It's more beautiful. Would that which we call a rose by any other name smell as sweet? And because both of you have strong relations with names and bodies of poems, I ask you this question, thinking also where you can also expand about your titles. In Rendang's first poem, we read, and I'm not sure I understand this line, if it's a quote by Stein or it's something else. Rose and rose have French and Frisian roots you can't hear. So first, ladies first, Ana Luisa, what's in a name? Why?
Hello. First of all, Margarida, thank you very much for this invitation. I would like to thank Ronda, the Festival of Poetry, for this invitation. It's a big pleasure being here, and it is a pleasure to meet Will. I didn't know your poetry. Of course, I went. I mean, I did some research, as we all do in these cases, and it's an enormous pleasure to be with Margarida again. I love what she writes, and as she knows, I like her very much. I mean, we are good friends. Anyway, the question is a bit difficult to answer because, but I know how to answer it naturally. It has to do with that quotation, that quote from Shakespeare. What is a name, that which we call? I'm sorry, it's not like that. My God, it's a little. What's in a name, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. We shouldn't forget that she's asking this to Romeo, saying, after all, that names are not important, that names are meaningless, that names are mere labels. And yes, in some sense, they are mere labels. I mean, why do I call a lamp a lamp? Why do I call a child when she is born Anna or William or Margarida or whatever? But the fact is that living in the world as we do, and from the start, from the beginning, we, of course, when we are born, we don't need names. When we are born, and I have a poem that says, what's not in a name, what is not in a name is the body. That's true when we are born, but then right after we are born, we are immersed in the social, in the society. And after being immersed in society, we are also immersed in language. And what happens is that language is made of names. Language is also a way of naming. I mean, even though poetry, after all, is made of names, is made of words. So in that regard, even when Romeo tells Juliet, you don't need to call me Romeo, just call me love, the very fact that she says love, that to call love to someone is a way of naming someone, is a way of calling someone. Then in a more political sense, so I mean, what I want to say is that from the one side, from one hand, her answer or her question is very naive, very innocent, because truly names do matter. To be a Capulet is a problem. It's not the same as to have some other name. So to be Romeo does mean something. And even though, and as I was saying, if we think in a more political way, in a more contemporary way, I think that, yes, names do matter a lot. For example, to have been called Samuel in the 50s, even now in Germany, for example, or in places where neo-Nazism is re-emerging, to be called Sarah is totally different than to be called Hans, or to be called Hans or Heinz or Abdul, or even, for example, here in Portugal, as we all know, names that people from some classes give, some social classes give to some children when they are born, trying to distinguish them from other children from what they consider to be lower classes. So, what I finally what I want to say is that it is a paradoxical thing. On the one side, names are meaningless because we don't need them, we shouldn't need them because they are mere labels. On the other hand, they do matter because they belong to language. And unfortunately, as I say in that poem, race is tamed by a few syllables. Yes, some races have been tamed because they have their names. I mean, the fact that they have their names is connected to the fact that they are colonized, for example. I'm thinking of Africa, I'm thinking of Asia, for example, Middle East, etc.
Okay, so will Rose and Rose have the same roots? Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Margarida, and yeah, it's such an honor to be here with you, Ana Luisa, as well, and thank you for having me at this festival. This is the closest I've been to Portugal, actually, so it's nice to be here virtually. So yeah, I mean, I really connect with what Ana Luisa was saying, and obviously Romeo and Juliet, even though a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, are still killed because of their names. They die for their names, and I think that's the two things that I've always held in mind, which is basically that a name is entirely arbitrary, but it also entirely dictates your life in so many ways. And I've always felt this from the perspective of being someone of Chinese Indonesian heritage, but growing up in London and not speaking that language. So all I have is this language, English, but I'm usually read as foreign. So I have to deal with these two kind of conflicting realities. So on the one hand, so race for me is an example of a name. Maybe that's a helpful way to think of race, as a way of naming people. So I'm always kind of named as foreign, as other, as Chinese, but doesn't tally with my lived experience. And the book I wrote is, in a sense, trying to make sense of that disconnect, that, the arbitrariness between the sign and the signifier, as Saussure puts it. So that line about what is it exactly? Yeah, rose and rose have French and Frisian root. That's a reference to rose, as in the flower has an etymological French root, and rose is in the past tense of rise, as in I rose at 7 this morning, has a Frisian root. And so they're words which sound the same, so they're homonyms, but their roots are completely different. And yet yet the surface is the same, but the kind of history is different. So that was the point, I guess, that language is a kind of flat surface, but it kind of has this optional depth depending on how much we read into it. I don't know if that helps.
Language can also, yes, it helps a lot. And I was thinking of Homer, and when I read your line, and the sunrise with the rosy fingers, and the fact that they have the same roots illuminates also backwards. But in your case, I wonder, can you show your first page, the dictionary part, where you put all the words with rent in your book?
The first poem.
Yeah. Would you care to speak a little about your title and how it relates to the value of words in the dictionary?
So the title Rendang
is not an easy title for a Portuguese. It might be more understandable in English, and apparently it comes in the Oxford in 1948. But for a Portuguese, I had to research it, and I'd like you to speak to our audience about it.
Here. I don't know how large the Indonesian community is in Portugal, but it's not very large here. And so rendang is a kind of Southeast Asian curry, and it was one of the few cultural reference points I had for Indonesia growing up, because my mom would often make it. But I guess I arranged it in terms of other words beginning ren from the Oxford English Dictionary in order of first usage. And I guess the point is, well, the point kind of changes for me quite a lot, but it's that on the one hand, this word represents a culture to me, but it's also just another arbitrary sign, just alongside all these other words, render, rended, rendry, rended, words which on the level of the dictionary and ordering system are just kind of flat signifiers. And so this is basically my relationship to Indonesia. Often I have these kind of pieces of a jigsaw, but they mean nothing in themselves because they're not lived. And that's often what I have to remind myself with language, with words, that ultimately a name is just a name. A name isn't the same as the experience of it. And I guess that's what it's about, this kind of barrier of words.
Thank you. About one other thing I read about rendang is that it can be, or it is also a word that has a spiritual meaning. So it's a celebration of communication with the others. I'm not sure if Wikipedia is right, but I will first ask Ana Luisa Amaral, because it has to do with an issue I think surfaces in both of your poetry work and also your essayist work, which is about what the lyric can and cannot do. And Ana Luisa Amaral wrote in an essay, a fold in the that poetry is a fold in the time of a language that establishes a relationship with the dead and with those not born yet. And so there seems to be the belief, and Will Harris has something to that effect. More, he talks about the poem as crossing over the time and language. There seems to be a belief that maybe comes from the romantic idea of the lyric in the transcendence of the poem, while at the same time you are both very aware of the situatedness and even of the privilege of he or she who writes poetry. So, Ana Luisa Amaral, do you want to comment? Is it more easier? Is it easier for poetry to break time than space?
Two. I
Break
didn't
time
understand.
than
No,
to
I didn't understand
cross.
the word. To cross
What?
time. Okay. I didn't understand the verb that you used. I'm sorry. Is it easier for
I
poets?
was making a metaphor. Yeah.
But I didn't
Break
understand
time.
the word.
Like you can break
Okay.
open time with poetry and
Okay.
maybe
Okay.
not
Okay.
space. And you have to be
That's it.
very aware and really want to understand
I
your
think.
space. Yeah.
Well, actually, I think it's both. I think that a poem is also always, always, always. It always belongs to its time. That is, if Shakespeare were to write nowadays, for example, I'm quite sure that he would write differently. But the fact is not. But then he would not be Shakespeare, right? What I mean is that art always belongs to its time, because poetry, in this case, poetry always belongs to the world. What I was writing then, when I said that, I also meant that my body, that our bodies communicate with the rest of the world. I communicate with the others. I'm nothing without the other. It is the other that makes me and unmakes me naturally. If it weren't for you, I would be speaking to what? To the walls? I mean, it wouldn't make any sense. That is, well, actually, that's what you do when you write a poem. You write to yourself when you are writing it. You're not writing to anyone else. But the second moment of the poem, the second part of the poem, I mean, for a poem to be in my point, from my point of view, to be to accomplish its mission, I mean, in many, 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 many brackets, it has to be shared with the others. So this idea of sharing, this idea of solidarity as well, this idea of partaking of something which, after all, belongs to us all, I think it exists. It exists in poetry. So going back, a poem always belongs to its time, but at the same time it crosses times. And this is why we can still read Shakespeare and enjoy Shakespeare and be moved by Shakespeare. And when I say Shakespeare, I can say so many other poets or so many other writers. It's interesting that you said something like, you said in this, you asked us, or you asked us if we would share the romantic idea, and well, I don't think so. What I would really take from romanticism in this case would be the word that they used. Well, it's not only the romantics they used. I mean, it's a very old word actually, but it's very associated with romanticism, of course, or the romantics, which is inspiration. We don't have any other word. I do not think that poetry is only work with language. It's not only work with language. It is a grammar, yes. And in that sense, it belongs to its time. But it's not only a grammar. It's not only um, it's not only you cannot teach a person. I do not believe that you can teach anyone to write, to be a poet, or even to write poetry. You can teach that person to read poetry. You can pass the passion for poetry. You can enhance the appetite, even the gusto for poems and for poetry, but you can't teach a poet. You cannot make a poet. So I hope I have more or less, answered to your question. It had to be with time and language. Language and we can separate language and time. They bound to each other, in this sense. So it belongs to its time. At the same time, it is timeless. Can be timeless. So I think it's both.
Yes, but it's I'm also interested in that idea of poetry as communicating with the dead, with
It's
so
tradition. That is tradition, right? As well.
yeah, and Will's book starts with the invocation of his grandmother, whom I gather probably passed away when the book was being written. So, what do you have to say about this space and time in poetry, Will?
Well, what Ana Luisa was saying very eloquently reminded me of a line from a Scottish poet, W.S. Graham, who has this beautiful poem called The Constructed Space, in which he says, I say this silence here, for in it I might hear you better. And I just love all the paradoxes in that line. I say this silence. And that reminded me of Ana Luisa saying, you're speaking to the wall, but you're speaking to the silence, but you're speaking. And so you're breaking the silence, but also you're creating a silence in which you might hear someone else, which holds out the possibility of connection. But yeah, and I've always thought there's something beautiful in that we do write to connect, even though it's always this impossible connection, because we'll never see it in the writing. Writing is always solitary. Reading is solitary, but in that there is a connection. And I don't think poetry stops time, but with poetry, I think it's the most time aware art form, or literary art form at least. In a novel you kind of race along, you're following a linear plot, you want to know what happens next and next and next and next. Whereas in a poem, time is suspended and we're aware of language, of words, of sounds, and that gives us a different relationship to time and space, which I think is one of the powerful things it does, and is maybe what allows it to have that incantatory or in quality of invoking the dead and summoning them, because time is suspended within a poem.
Okay. Unfortunately, our time is limited, and there would be lots of questions that I would like to ask you. I would very much like to hear you also on craft, but I'm not sure that we have that much time spent. So, and I think it's a privilege that we have two living poets with whom to speak to and whom we can hear talk about their work. So what I'll ask you now, as you both are going to read a poem, is that before you read your poems, you speak a little bit about your book, the book where the poem is, other books, whatever is your poetic statement for today. Well, I'm particularly interested in to come back to the start of our conversation. In the poems you both have chosen, there's an interesting relation between the title, the name of the poem, and the body of the poem. And again, we are in this. It becomes a dichotomy, although we wouldn't think so. The name and the body. So again, I'll start with Ana Luisa, and will you share some of your thoughts, craft, with us?
Of course. Thank you very much. I'm going to read from my book here in Portugal. It's The cover is the New Directions one is very beautiful too, but this one is in the Portuguese one, which I think it's beautiful because it's these are the caves in Argentina, and it's I don't know how to say pintura rupestre, Margarida, in English.
It's a cave painting.
Pintura, yeah, cave paintings. It's a cave paintings in Argentina, where our ancestors, instead of writing their names, they put their hands on the walls and they painted. And in a way, they left their marks. It's beautiful. Anyway, I'm just going to say that there's an interesting story associated with the poem I'm going to read, because Margaret Costa, who is my translator into English, she thought that the poem referred to a cat, when it actually refers to a dog, as you're going to see. And yet it begins as if it is referring to a person. So I'm not going to say anything else. I'm just going to read the poem. No estudo em comoção, em que meditas tu, quando olhas para mim dessa maneira, deitada no sofá, diagonal ao espaço onde me sento, fingindo eu não te olhar, em que penso ao teu corpo elástico, alongado, pronto a vir ter comigo se eu pedir, as orelhas contidas em recanto, as patas recuadas, o que atravessa agora o branco dos teus olhos, lua em quarto crescente, um prado claro, e quando dormes, como noutras horas, que sonhos te viajam, a mãe, a caça, a mão macia, o salto muito perfeito e alto, muito esguio, onde a noite sem frio que nos abrigará um dia e que há de ser, só pode ser, igual.
Thank you so much. I'm going to read the translation by Margaret Costa. I'm sure you both have been working on these translations together. Ana Luisa Amaral is also a wonderful translator of poetry. She has given us Emily Dickinson, Adrian Rich, Updike, recently Louise Gluck. And yeah, that was a shared enterprise. And we are going to, I'm going to read Margaret and Amaral, or Jul Costa and Amaral, Nude, a Study in Poignancy. What are you thinking about when you look at me like that, as you lie on the sofa, diagonal to the place I sit, with me pretending not to look at you? What is your body thinking about? Your long, elastic body ready to come to me if I call. Ears slightly pricked, paws furled. What can you see now in the whites of your eyes? A crescent moon, a pale meadow? And when you sleep at other times, what dreams travel through you, your mother, a mouse, a soft hand, a lip so perfect and high, so light? Where the uncold night that will one day shelter us, and that will, as it must be, as it must, the same for both. Now, we are going to hear the poem The Hanged Man, but before, feel free to speak about your collection, where the poem fits or doesn't fit inside the book, whatever you want to share with the listeners of this festival.
Well, yeah, just firstly, that was beautiful, Ana Luisa. Thank you. And I hope I can come to Portugal in person at some point.
You will, definitely you will.
Yeah.
We also hope you can.
Yes. In body.
The book is the book is mainly made up of sequences. So this is a shorter poem, and the only thing I can think which most strongly links it is, and maybe links to what I was saying, is this idea of poetry being this way of expressing contradiction or holding in mind multiple ideas at the same time. So this was inspired in particular by a tarot card from the Rider-Waite deck, the kind of famous Victorian one, of the Hanged Man, which is a figure who's hanging upside down from a tree. And it doesn't actually signify death, which you might think. It actually signifies indecision or uncertainty. And it's a card I connect with a lot. So this is called The Hanged Man. He bought a seeded loaf and 2 ripe and ready avocados and left them in the hallway. And at lunch the next day went to Chipotle on Charing Cross Road, then back to work. And afterwards bought a ring donut from Tesco because there were no jam donuts. That night, though he didn't think he was a hoarder, he started ordering records online, and soon he had bought the whole of Bruce Springsteen's back catalogue. I hate Bruce Springsteen, he thought. I want to eat better. The next week, listening to Human Touch, he dozed and woke to find himself floating 2 feet off the ground, hanging there. His parents were alive and dead. If only he could keep completely still, he could remain unscattered, forever on the edge of rain.
O Pendurado. I'm going to read the translation. It's still a draft, but which I made of Phil's poems. O Pendurado. Comprou pão de sementes e 2 abacates maduros no ponto e deixou-os no corredor à entrada. E no dia seguinte o almoço foi no Chipotle, na Charing Cross Road, depois voltou ao emprego. E a seguir comprou no Tesco um donut dos de argola, por já não haver dos que são tipo bola com geleia. Nessa noite, embora ele não achasse que era um acumulador, começou a encomendar discos online. No instante já tinha a coleção toda dos fundos de catálogo de Bruce Springsteen. Detesto Bruce Springsteen, pensou ele. Quero comer melhor. Na semana seguinte, ao ouvir Human Touch, passou pelas brasas e quando acordou deu por si a flutuar a meio metro do chão, ali pendurado. Os pais estavam vivos e já mortos. Era só ficar completamente quieto para se manter sem dispersão, para sempre a ameaçar chuva. Okay, thank you both for being with us at this festival. Thanks to the Ronda Festival production for this event that, in the absence of bodies, has to be made online. And it has been a pleasure being with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarida.
Thank you, both.
Thank you, Will.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita.